The Trimui Smart Pro was a handheld that I thought had an amazing price to performance ratio that only got better with time and as well had pretty good build quality. So when I found out that they were going to try to make a vertical handheld using the same internals and make it a compact handheld at that, I was all on board and really excited for this thing. Priced this thing aggressively at around $50, and because it's sort of in between that mini and standard size for vertical handhelds, it's really competing up against things like a Miyoo Mini or a Miyoo Mini Plus. So getting this in my hands, I'm going to keep that in mind. Is this something that could technically replace that handheld for a lot of people? Or if you're looking to spend around $50 on a vertical handheld, is this going to be the device that you should pick up indefinitely? That's what we're going to take a look at here today. I'm not 100% certain that this is an out the box winner for a lot of people, but most handhelds in this price range really aren't. This does have some amazing features like being able to hot swap the back keys that are on here, and they actually do a good job of including a few extra sets of these in the box. So you get 3 sets of back buttons included in that $50 price point. Here I am going to just fumble around putting some of these on so you can see kind of the differences in what you could do with this thing. But just having a feature like that right out of the box is really cool. So these ones here are supposed to kind of raise up the L2 and R2 to kind of differentiate where they sit at on the back, so it's easier to kind of feel with your fingers. And I think it's pretty cool. I think the feeling of pressing in these buttons actually feels really good. Now, without a doubt, the shining star of this handheld is going to be the display. It's 3.2 inches, so it sits somewhere in between the screen size of a Miyoo Mini and a Miyoo Mini Plus, but the pixel density is quite huge. You're talking 1024 by 768, which is a really sharp display, as well as the fact that this thing gets really bright and can put out some amazing colors. And because it's using the same operating system that we had on the Trimui Smart Pro, you can actually go in and do things like change your contrast ratios as well as bump up your saturation. So if you like a more vivid picture, it's something that you can do right out of the box, and I definitely think that it really shines. Now, I'm not someone who really particularly likes a tiny screen. The regular Miyoo Mini was just a little too small for me, but I did really enjoy my Miyoo Mini Plus. And so this thing has been an absolute treat because it sits right in the middle, like I said before, and I don't find it to be too small. And I do think that the higher resolution on the screen is great. Now, when it comes to using the D-pad and the face buttons on the Trimui Brick, I am a big fan of these face buttons. They're somewhere in between clicky and tactile, but not quite micro switch clicky and not very loud, but they're definitely not mushy buttons either. They have a very short travel. Now, when it comes to fighting games and doing things like pulling off special moves and using rolls and things like that, this isn't going to be the best D-pad for that. I think it's something I could warm up to, but it's a bit sharp on the thumbs, and it does take a little bit more force to kind of get those inputs exactly where you want them. But I can only really see this being a negative thing in fighting games. And again, it's something that I think could be adapted to in time. I'm just not used to it because it's quite a unique feeling. Now, in the beginning of the review, I mentioned how the Trimui Smart Pro got a little bit better with time, and I'm kind of anticipating the same thing here for the Brick. Now, expect really good emulation up to PS1, and after that, I would consider everything else a bonus. Do you think that eventually we will start seeing some optimizations either in firmware updates or in custom firmware? CrossMix OS really transformed the Trimui Smart Pro, and I know that we're just probably a few weeks away from seeing a build of that. But when it comes to things like N64, here we are playing one of the harder to run titles, Cruisin' USA, and it's just completely unplayable at these frame rates. And to further my point about N64, there's just something out of the box not set up quite right, because here I am playing South Park Rally, and as you can see, there's a ton of graphical glitches going on screen. Things aren't rendering. It's making the game completely unplayable, but performance wise it does seem like the frame rate is pretty solid, ironically. So this is something that will probably have to be addressed either in some settings changes or some custom firmware down the line. And I did notice when I was playing those games that this back plate here is metal and it's kind of getting a little warm to the touch, so I'm assuming it's acting as some sort of heat spreader, but just something I did want to bring light to. Now, another point that I wanted to bring up is with the games card that is included with this device, tons of the games are having issues with launching. from PlayStation 1 and even some Dreamcast games booting you into a BIOS screen. So keep that in mind. If this was a handheld that you were looking to pick up for somebody as, say, a gift, it is going to kind of affect it in that way where I just don't think that this is a very giftable device, at least until maybe later on down the road we can start seeing some of these devices ship with better firmware or custom firmware down the line. But I do want to point that out because this might be someone's first handheld and they might be very frustrated learning that they're going to have to tinker with things and learn how to use it. Now, these two illuminated keys here at the top are not start and select. They're actually function keys, and that drove me nuts. Start and select are down here at the bottom next to the menu button here. Now, these are able to be programmed for numerous different tasks if you go through these settings here. But several times while playing a game, I pushed those buttons in thinking that I was hitting start or hitting select, and then found out later that they were function keys and I wasn't even sure what I was actually enabling. So if you go in here, there's a ton of different options that you can choose from to make them do various different things like turbo and auto fire certain buttons, as well as moving through the different power profiles of the device. So if you wanted to use like the CPU max mode or whatever, or even just turning on or off the LEDs with one of those buttons. But honestly, I wish I could just map them to start and select. So maybe that'll be something we can do in custom firmware. Now, I did want to point out that from the menu here, you can actually just access RetroArch and change all of your settings and configurations right from in here, which is going to be helpful if you're not familiar with a Trimui device, but you are familiar with something like RetroArch, and you can even launch your games from here. So I thought that that was a really neat addition. I kind of forgot that that was something you could do with the Smart Pro. Now, I don't want to touch on this too much, but there are some ports like Balatro and Celeste, as well as Stardew Valley on here from the manufacturer, and I'm pretty upset about that, but I don't want to get into it here. Next up, I wanted to compare to a few different handhelds here. So we have the Miyoo Mini Plus next to the Brick here, and I wanted to point out the obvious position of the D-pad and face buttons as opposed to the body of each handheld. And for me, the Miyoo Mini Plus's buttons always felt a little too close to the bottom of the device, and that was one of the things that got me the most excited for the Brick, because I've been waiting for something that is around the size of a Miyoo Mini Plus, but just had those buttons pushed up a bit more so I could find it a little bit more comfortable, and we finally got it here with this device. And just for fun, I wanted to put an Ambernick in the mix just to show you the size difference as well. So this is the 35XX Plus, and it manages to not only be less tall, but also is slimmer than both the Miyoo Mini and the Ambernick, which means it's going to be that much more pocketable. Now, one thing this thing is guilty of is picking up fingerprints really bad. It's such a smudgy screen. It drives me absolutely bonkers. No matter how much you seem to wipe it away with a cloth, unless you use some sort of spray-on liquid or screen cleaner, it seems like you'll never fully get all of the fingerprints off the device. And this is something that happens to most budget devices, but this is really bad here. Now, one cool hidden feature I found was after my battery finally got critically low, the LEDs on the back here on the shoulder button started to flash red. And then when I plugged in the device, I found out that the power button actually works as a battery indicator as well while charging. And when it did complete charging, it went totally solid green, which is pretty neat for a budget handheld. Now, I did want to take a second to actually talk about the build of the device, and we do have a function switch over here that I neglected to mention earlier, as well as an extra USB-C port at the top that I presume is for connecting accessories. And down here at the bottom, you have your charge port, a 3.5 audio jack, the SD card reader, and then this tiny little recessed reset button, which I assume is for a hard reset of the device. And the actual handheld is two separate pieces. This back piece here seems to be different than this piece here, which is metal, which I assume is to be used as some sort of heat spreader. And we have some textured ribbing with the Trimui logo as well. Now, I'm going to close this video out by stating that this was not really a review of the Trimui Brick and more of just a first look. And the reason I say that is because I have a lot of confidence that this device and software will evolve quite a lot over the next few weeks. There's already custom firmware working on this, things like Newly. The developer of CrossMix OS has already stated that he's begun work on this device, and I just think that there's a lot of things in the grander landscape of this handheld that are set to change probably pretty quickly here. But regardless of that, I know a lot of people are going to be itching to pick this up and get their hands on it, so I wanted to give my first impressions. And to be honest with you, I think this device is great. I think it offers a great value for the price that they're asking at around $55 to $60, depending on where you pick it up. And I can already tell you, this is going to be a handheld that's going to get a lot of love from the community. And I think it's going to be a great, long lasting handheld. Do I think a lot of people need to pick this up if they already own something like a Miyoo Mini or an Ambernic RG35XX? Not really. I do think that it feels better than both of those devices in a lot of ways. And some things that I didn't really get into or mention was the fact that this does also have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So when things like CrossMix come up, you'll be able to update your firmware over the air, which will be nice. I do think that we'll get a lot of improvement on emulators like N64 and Dreamcast and PSP. It's just at this current state, it's hard to fully recommend picking it up if you're someone who's never really had a handheld, doesn't really know how to mess with file structures and adding games and changing configurations and things like that. This is definitely not something in this state that I think you would buy for somebody and give it to them. But I do think, like I said, that is something that will most likely change. But those were just my first impressions. If you like the video, make sure you like it. If you're new here, please consider hitting the subscription button down below, and we'll see you in the next one.